There is a question that almost nobody asks when they tell the Frank Lucas story, and it is the question this video exists to answer. Everyone wants to know how Frank built Blue Magic. Everyone wants to know how he survived the 5 Italian families. Everyone wants to know how he turned his own arrest into the most consequential cooperation agreement in New York law enforcement history. Almost nobody asks what his wife knew, what she did with that knowledge, and why the woman who stood beside him through all of it has been reduced, in nearly every telling, to a beautiful footnote. This video corrects that omission. San Juan, Puerto Rico, 1965. A beauty pageant on a warm evening. The kind of event that fills a hotel ballroom with families dressed in their best clothes and young women who have spent months preparing for 3 minutes on a stage. Julie Farrait is 20 years old. She is, by every account that survives from that period, extraordinarily beautiful, the specific kind of beauty that gets noticed in rooms full of people specifically gathered to notice beauty, which is a higher bar than it sounds. She wins. Not the pageant in this telling. The actual pageant result is less important to this story than what happens after it. When a man visiting from New York City, a man whose business in Puerto Rico nobody in the room fully understands, sees Julie Farrait and decides, with the specific decisiveness that characterizes every major decision in his life, that he is going to marry her. The man is Frank Lucas. He is approaching 40. He has been building for the better part of a decade the foundation of what will become the most profitable narcotics operation in the history of New York City, though in 1965, 3 years before Bumpy Johnson's death and the full emergence of Blue Magic, the empire is still in its early stages, still being assembled piece by piece by a man whose patience and discipline were taught to him by the best teacher Harlem's underworld had ever produced. Frank Lucas sees Julie Farrait and pursues her with the same combination of patience and decisiveness that defines everything else about how he operates. He does not rush. He does not overwhelm her with the specific kind of attention that men with money often use to substitute for genuine interest. He courts her over months with the careful deliberateness of a man who has learned that the things worth having are worth waiting for and worth building correctly. Julie Farrait, for her part, is not naive about who Frank Lucas is or what he does. The specific details of his business may not have been fully transparent to her in the earliest stages of their relationship, but the general shape of it, a black American businessman from New York with substantial and unexplained wealth, operating in a world that does not advertise its activities publicly, was not difficult to infer for a woman of Julie's intelligence and social awareness. She married him anyway. This is where most tellings of the Frank Lucas story, when they mention Julie at all, stop paying attention. She becomes a supporting detail, the beautiful wife, the glamorous accessory to Frank's rise, a figure who exists in the narrative primarily to illustrate the scale of Frank's success rather than as a person whose own choices and own agency shape the story in ways that deserve examination on their own terms. This is the story that corrects that omission. Julie Farrait moved to New York and entered a marriage that placed her, within a few years, at the center of the most significant criminal enterprise in the city's narcotics trade. The specific nature of her involvement in Frank's operation has been a subject of considerable speculation across the decades since the empire's collapse. Speculation that ranges from the position that Julie was a fully knowing and active participant in the operation's management to the position that she was, in the language that defense attorneys and sympathetic biographers have sometimes used, an innocent bystander whose only crime was loving a man whose business she did not fully understand. The truth, as is almost always the case with claims this binary, sits somewhere in the considerable space between these two positions. And understanding where it sits requires looking carefully at what Julie Farrait actually did during the years of Frank's operation rather than relying on the simplified narratives that both prosecution and defense had institutional reasons to prefer. What is documented through court records and subsequent interviews and the testimony that emerged during the federal investigation into Frank's operation is that Julie Farrait was deeply involved in the financial infrastructure that supported Frank's empire. Not the narcotics distribution itself. There is no credible evidence that Julie was involved in the operational side of moving blue magic from source to street, the side of the business that Frank's brothers and lieutenants managed. Julie's involvement was in the side of the operation that every large criminal enterprise eventually requires, and that is, in some ways, more legally perilous than the underlying criminal activity itself, the management and concealment of the enormous cash flows that the operation generated. Frank Lucas's operation, at its peak, was generating revenue exceeding $1 million a day. This kind of cash flow creates a specific and substantial problem for any criminal enterprise. The problem of what to do with money that cannot be deposited in a bank account without triggering exactly the kind of regulatory scrutiny that exposes the underlying criminal activity. The solution that Frank's organization developed over the years of the operation's growth involved a combination of approaches: investment in legitimate businesses that could absorb and launder cash, the physical storage and movement of cash in ways that avoided banking system scrutiny, and the strategic use of trusted family members and associates to manage portions of the financial infrastructure in ways that distributed risk and avoided concentrating the entire operation's financial vulnerability in any single point of failure. Julie Farrait, according to the records and testimony that emerged in the years following Frank's arrest, was one of the people Frank trusted with significant pieces of this financial infrastructure. She managed real estate investments. She participated in the structuring of legitimate business fronts that helped launder portions of the operation's cash flow. She had, by multiple accounts, detailed knowledge of the scale and the mechanics of an operation that, on paper, she had no formal role in and no documented income from. This is the specific tension embedded in Julie Farrait's position throughout the years of Frank's empire. She occupied a role that was simultaneously central to the operation's continued functioning and almost entirely invisible to the external world, including, in significant part, to the law enforcement agencies that spent years building cases against Frank's organization without fully understanding the role his wife played in the financial architecture that made the operation sustainable. The specific knowledge that Julie Farrait possessed, the knowledge referenced in the framing of this story, the knowledge that she knew everything, requires careful examination, because the claim of complete knowledge is both broadly true in its general shape and specifically complicated in its details. Julie Farrait knew, by any reasonable assessment of the documented record, the general scale and nature of her husband's business. She knew that the wealth that supported their lifestyle, the houses, including the Teaneck property that would later become a piece of evidence in the federal case, the furs and jewelry, and the specific markers of conspicuous wealth that Frank, despite his general preference for operational discretion, did allow Julie to enjoy, came from narcotics distribution rather than any legitimate business activity. She knew the names of at least some of the people involved in the operation's leadership, including Frank's brothers, who she interacted with regularly as family, even as they functioned within the operation as territorial managers overseeing significant portions of the distribution network. She knew, through her own direct involvement in managing portions of the financial infrastructure, the specific mechanics of how cash moved, how it was concealed, how it was converted into assets that could be held and enjoyed without triggering the kind of scrutiny that direct possession of enormous amounts of cash would invite. What Julie Farrait likely did not know, with the same specificity and certainty, were the operational details of the narcotics distribution itself, the specific supply chain through Thailand and the Golden Triangle, the mechanics of the Vietnam coffin operation, the day-to-day management of street-level distribution across Harlem and the Bronx and Brooklyn. This was not Julie's domain within the operation, and Frank, who structured every aspect of his enterprise according to careful compartmentalization, had no particular reason to share operational details that fell outside the financial infrastructure Julie helped manage. The picture that emerges from the available record is of a woman who possessed comprehensive knowledge of the financial architecture and general scale of her husband's criminal enterprise while maintaining, by design and through the specific structure of how Frank organized his operation, a degree of separation from the operational mechanics of the underlying narcotics trade. This is not the picture of either complete innocence or complete operational involvement. It is the picture of a specific and carefully bounded form of knowledge and participation that placed Julie Farrait in a legally precarious position without making her, in the narrowest technical sense, a narcotics trafficker in the way that her husband and his brothers were not the question of what Julie Farrait did with this knowledge. The question that gives this story its central tension becomes most significant in the period surrounding Frank's 1975 arrest and the federal investigation and prosecution that followed. Federal investigators, in building their case against Frank Lucas, understood that Julie's knowledge of the financial infrastructure made her a potentially valuable source of information and potentially, depending on how the investigation developed, a co-defendant facing her own significant legal exposure. The specific dynamics of how federal prosecutors approached Julie Farrait in the months following Frank's arrest, and the specific decisions Julie made in response to that approach, are documented in court records that have received considerably less public attention than the more dramatic elements of Frank's own cooperation and the resulting 100+ convictions of corrupt law enforcement officials. What the record shows is that Julie Farrait, facing potential prosecution for her role in the financial infrastructure of Frank's operation, made choices that protected both herself and, in significant ways, the structure of assets and resources that would matter considerably to Frank's family in the years of his imprisonment and beyond. She did not, by any account, provide the kind of comprehensive cooperation against her husband that Frank himself provided against the corrupt law enforcement network. The dynamics of spousal loyalty, complicated by genuine marital partnership and by Julie's own legal exposure, produced a different calculation than the one Frank made about cooperating against police officers and federal agents who had no particular claim on his loyalty. But Julie Farrait did, according to the available record, navigate her own legal exposure with a level of strategic intelligence that mirrors, in its own register, the kind of careful calculation that characterized Frank's most significant decisions throughout his career. She protected certain assets. She structured her own legal position in ways that minimized her exposure, while preserving resources that would matter to the family's circumstances during the years Frank spent in federal custody. She made decisions in the specific period when the empire was collapsing around her that reflected a woman who had absorbed, through years of proximity to Frank's operational thinking, some of the same patient and strategic approach to crisis that defined her husband's most significant moves. This is not a story of Julie Farrait as a passive victim of circumstances entirely outside her control. It is also not a story of Julie Farrait as a criminal mastermind operating an empire in parallel to her husband's. It is the more complicated and more interesting story of a woman who occupied a genuinely unprecedented position, married to the most significant narcotics trafficker in New York City history, deeply knowledgeable about the financial architecture of an empire generating extraordinary wealth, and faced, when that empire collapsed, with the specific challenge of protecting herself and her family's resources while navigating a legal system that had every reason to view her with the same scrutiny it applied to Frank's most senior lieutenants. Years following Frank's 1975 arrest and subsequent cooperation with federal prosecutors were, for Julie Farrait, a period of navigating consequences that her husband's decisions had set in motion, without her full control over how those consequences would unfold. Frank's cooperation, which resulted in more than 100 convictions of corrupt police officers and federal agents, was a decision that Frank made primarily in his own strategic interest to reduce his sentence, to convert the catastrophe of his arrest into the best available outcome given the circumstances. The cooperation did not extend, in any documented way, to providing information about Julie's role in the financial infrastructure of the operation, which suggests that Frank, even in the midst of comprehensively dismantling the corrupt law enforcement network that had protected his operation, maintained a specific boundary around protecting his wife from the legal exposure and full transparency about every aspect of the operation's financial architecture would have created. This boundary, the specific limit of what Frank was willing to expose, even in the context of his broader cooperation, reveals something significant about the nature of his relationship with Julie that goes beyond the simplified narratives of either complete partnership or purely transactional marriage. Frank Lucas, who calculated his way through every major decision of his operational life with a clarity that rarely admitted sentiment as a relevant variable, made a specific and consistent choice to protect Julie from the full legal consequences that his comprehensive cooperation against everyone else in his orbit might otherwise have created. This was not an oversight. Frank Lucas did not make oversights of this magnitude. It was a deliberate decision, embedded within his broader strategy of cooperation, to draw a boundary around his wife's legal exposure that he did not draw around anyone else connected to his operation. The specific reasons for this boundary, whether it reflected genuine love, a calculation about Julie's usefulness to his post-prison life, a recognition of the practical necessity of having someone outside federal custody to manage what remained of the family's resources, or some combination of all of these factors, are not fully documented and likely cannot be fully known. What is documented is the outcome. Julie Farrait, despite her substantial knowledge of and participation in the financial infrastructure of one of the largest narcotics operations in American history, was never prosecuted with anything approaching the severity that her husband and his lieutenants faced. She navigated the collapse of the empire that had defined her adult life with a degree of legal and financial survival that reflects either exceptional luck, exceptional strategic management of her own exposure, or, most likely, some combination of both, supported by her husband's specific decision to protect her, even as he comprehensively exposed everyone else who had been part of his world. The marriage between Frank Lucas and Julie Farrait survived his arrest, his cooperation, his 5 years in federal prison, and his eventual release in 1981. This survival is, in its own way, as significant a part of this story as the financial infrastructure and the legal navigation that preceded it. Marriages that survive the specific stress of a spouse's federal prosecution and imprisonment are relatively rare, and marriages that survive the additional complexity of a spouse's extensive cooperation with federal authorities, cooperation that necessarily meant Frank spent considerable time in the years following his arrest in close proximity to federal prosecutors and law enforcement officials, the exact people that the code of the world he had inhabited treated as permanent enemies, are rarer still. Julie Farrait remained, by every account from the years following Frank's release, his wife and his partner through the complicated process of building a different kind of life after the empire had ended. She had married a young man with unexplained wealth and unclear business activities. In 1965, she remained married to an old man who had spent 5 years in federal prison and had become, through his cooperation, one of the most significant figures in the history of New York law enforcement corruption prosecutions. By the time of his death in 2019, the specific arc of that marriage, from a beauty queen's whirlwind, courtship by a mysterious and wealthy suitor, through years of deep involvement in the financial architecture of an empire built on narcotics distribution, through the collapse of that empire in the specific legal navigation that protected her from its most severe consequences, to decades of marriage that survived imprisonment and cooperation, and the complicated process of rebuilding a life in the empire's aftermath, is a story that deserves to be told on its own terms, not simply as a footnote to Frank's more dramatic narrative. Julie Farrait knew, by any reasonable accounting of the documented record, far more about the operation that defined her husband's life than the simplified narratives of innocent wife or glamorous accessory typically acknowledge. What she did with that knowledge, protecting herself, protecting certain resources, navigating a legal system that could have treated her with far greater severity than it ultimately did, and remaining, through all of it, married to the man at the center of the story, reflects a woman whose own intelligence and strategic capacity deserves recognition, independent of her husband's more thoroughly documented genius for navigating crisis. The question of whether Julie Farrait was complicit, victim, partner, or some combination that resists the simplicity of any single label is not a question with a clean answer. But the documented record makes clear that she was never the passive figure that the simplified versions of the Frank Lucas story have generally made her out to be. She knew, she navigated, she survived, and the specific way she did all three deserves to be understood as part of the larger story, not erased from it in service of a narrative that finds it easier to focus exclusively on Frank. Now, if this story showed you a side of the Frank Lucas empire that gets erased in almost every telling, if you didn't know that his wife held detailed knowledge of the financial architecture of one of the largest narcotics operations in American history and survived its collapse with a clarity and strategic capacity that mirrors her. Husbands, subscribe right now. Because the women in these stories are almost never given the same examination as the men, and that omission is its own kind of historical distortion. Drop a comment. Do you think Julie Farrait was an innocent bystander, a full partner, or something more complicated than either label allows? Next week, we go inside the relationship between Frank Lucas and the federal agent who spent years hunting him and ended up becoming the person Frank trusted most with his appeals. Turn on notifications. The real story is always darker than you think, and it almost always includes people that the simplified version leaves out to understand the full significance of Julie Farrait's position within Frank Lucas's empire. It helps to understand the broader historical context of women's roles within major narcotics organizations of the era. Because Julie's position was both typical of certain patterns that recurred across the narcotics trade and atypical in the specific scale and sophistication of what she managed, women in major criminal enterprises throughout the 20th century have occupied a recurring set of roles that historians of organized crime have documented extensively, roles that range from purely domestic partnership with no operational involvement, to limited financial management of household resources, to, in rarer and more significant cases, deep involvement in the financial infrastructure that supports large-scale criminal operations. The specific pattern that Julie Farrait's involvement most closely resembles is the third category, the wife who becomes, through years of proximity and trust, a genuine participant in the financial architecture of her husband's enterprise, occupying a position that is simultaneously essential to the operation's functioning and largely invisible to external scrutiny. precisely because the assumption that wives are merely domestic partners provides a form of structural camouflage that law enforcement investigations have historically been slow to penetrate. This pattern is not unique to Frank Lucas's operation. It recurs across the history of organized crime in ways that reflect both the practical reality that men running large criminal enterprises need trusted people to manage sensitive financial matters, and the specific gender dynamics of mid-20th century American society that made wives a particularly useful category of trusted associate precisely because they were assumed by investigators and by the broader public to be uninvolved in their husband's business activities. Julie Farrait's specific version of this pattern was distinguished by the scale of the operation she was connected to and by the specific sophistication of the financial infrastructure she helped manage. Frank Lucas's empire, generating revenue exceeding $1 million a day at its peak, required financial management of a complexity that exceeded almost anything else in the contemporary narcotics trade. The specific challenges of managing that scale of cash flow, converting it into assets, structuring legitimate business fronts that could plausibly account for portions of it, maintaining the kind of documentation and organizational discipline that would allow Frank to track and verify what was happening with resources that could not, by their nature, be tracked through any conventional financial system, required a level of organizational capability that Frank trusted to relatively few people. Julie Farrait was one of those people, which tells us something significant about how Frank assessed her capabilities and her trustworthiness that goes beyond the simple fact of their marriage. Frank Lucas did not extend trust casually. His entire operational philosophy, learned from Bumpy Johnson and refined through years of building and protecting an empire that depended on careful compartmentalization, was built around the principle that trust should be extended only to people who had demonstrated, through observation and through the specific test of smaller responsibilities successfully executed, that they could be relied upon with larger ones. The fact that Julie Farrait occupied a significant position within the financial infrastructure of Frank's operation indicates that she had passed whatever tests Frank applied to determine trustworthiness that she had demonstrated over the years of their marriage and her involvement in the operation. The specific combination of discretion, competence, and loyalty that Frank required of anyone he trusted with sensitive responsibilities. This is not a small thing. Frank Lucas's brothers occupied trusted positions within the operation because of the specific and absolute loyalty that family relationships provided, the kind of loyalty that, as Frank himself articulated in various interviews over the years, he trusted more than any other form of relationship precisely because was not contingent on calculation or self-interest in the way that hired lieutenants' loyalty inevitably was. Julie Farrait occupied a trusted position, not through the family loyalty that bound Frank's brothers to the operation, but through the specific trust that develops between marriage partners who have demonstrated, over years of shared life and shared risk, that they can rely on each other. This form of trust is different from family loyalty, but is not necessarily weaker. And the fact that Frank extended it to Julie in the specific form of significant financial responsibility within his operation suggests that their marriage, whatever its origins in a beauty pageant courtship and whatever complications attended its survival through prison and cooperation and rebuilding, involved a genuine partnership that exceeded the simplified narrative of a glamorous wife as accessory to a powerful man's success. Specific financial mechanisms that Julie Farrait helped manage deserve more detailed examination because they illustrate both the sophistication of Frank's overall operation and the specific skills that Julie brought to her role within it. Cash-intensive criminal enterprises face a structural challenge that legitimate businesses do not. The revenue they generate cannot simply be deposited into bank accounts without triggering the kind of regulatory scrutiny currency transaction reports, suspicious activity monitoring, the entire infrastructure of banking, regulation that developed throughout the 20th century specifically to make it difficult for large amounts of unexplained cash to enter the legitimate financial system without scrutiny that would immediately expose the underlying criminal activity. Frank Lucas's operation, generating cash flows in the hundreds of thousands and eventually millions of dollars per week, faced this challenge at a scale that few criminal enterprises in American history had previously confronted. The solutions that Frank's organization developed involved multiple parallel approaches, and Julie Farrait's specific area of involvement appears to have centered on real estate, investment, and the structuring of legitimate business fronts, two of the most common and most effective methods that sophisticated criminal enterprises have historically used to convert cash into assets that can be held, enjoyed, and eventually liquidated without the same level of scrutiny that direct cash holdings would invite. Real estate investment, in particular, offered specific advantages that made it a natural area of focus for Julie's involvement. Property purchases could be structured through legitimate transactions, recorded through normal county property records, and held as assets that appreciated in value over time, while requiring no ongoing explanation of their income source beyond the initial purchase transaction. The Teaneck house that would later become a piece of evidence in the federal tax evasion case was one example of this strategy, a substantial cash purchase that, while it ultimately became a liability when Richard Malone's indiscretion led federal investigators to it, represented exactly the kind of asset conversion strategy that Frank's organization used repeatedly to manage its cash flow. Julie Farrait's involvement in identifying properties, negotiating purchases, and managing the resulting real estate portfolio required skills that went beyond simple trust and loyalty. It required genuine competence in real estate markets, financial analysis, and the kind of administrative organization that managing a substantial property portfolio demands. The legitimate business fronts that Julie helped structure represented a parallel and complementary strategy. Cash-intensive legitimate businesses, restaurants, laundromats, retail operations of various kinds, provided a mechanism for explaining cash flow that could not otherwise be accounted for. By blending illegitimate revenue with the legitimate revenue that such businesses genuinely generated, structuring these fronts effectively required understanding not just how to establish a business, but how to manage its books in ways that could plausibly account for revenue levels that exceeded what the legitimate business activity alone would generate, without creating the kind of obvious discrepancies that would attract regulatory attention. This is sophisticated financial work, requiring genuine analytical capability, and Julie Farrait's involvement in it suggests a level of financial sophistication that the simplified narrative of Beauty Queen Wife entirely fails to capture. The specific moment when this financial infrastructure became most legally significant was, inevitably, in the period immediately following Frank's arrest in August 1975, when federal investigators began the process of identifying and seizing the assets that Frank's operation had accumulated over 7 years. Asset forfeiture in major narcotics cases of this era was a developing area of federal law enforcement practice, and the specific challenge that investigators faced in Frank's case was substantial, an operation that had generated hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue over 7 years, converted through real estate, legitimate business fronts, and other asset classes into a portfolio whose full scope and ownership structure was not immediately apparent from the outside. Julie Farrait, who had detailed knowledge of this asset portfolio because she had helped build significant portions of it, occupied a position of considerable importance in the process that followed Frank's arrest, both as a potential target of asset forfeiture proceedings herself, given her documented involvement in managing portions of the financial infrastructure, and as someone whose cooperation or lack of cooperation with federal investigators could significantly affect how successfully the government was able to trace and seize the operation's accumulated wealth. The specific decisions Julie made during this period, which assets to acknowledge, which to contest, how to structure her own legal defense in ways that protected both herself and, where possible, family resources that would matter too. Frank's circumstances during his imprisonment, and to the family's broader financial stability, required exactly the kind of strategic calculation under pressure that characterized Frank's own most significant decisions throughout the crisis of his arrest and prosecution. Julie Farrait was not simply a bystander watching her husband's empire collapse around her. She was an active participant in managing the legal and financial consequences of that collapse, navigating a federal investigation that had every reason to scrutinize her own conduct with the same intensity it applied to Frank's lieutenants, and emerging from that period of intense legal exposure without the kind of severe prosecution that her documented involvement in the operation's financial infrastructure might, in a different set of circumstances, have produced. This outcome reflects multiple factors working in combination. Frank's specific decision to protect Julie, even within the context of his broader cooperation with federal prosecutors, Julie's own strategic navigation of her legal exposure, and likely some degree of prosecutorial discretion that reflected the practical reality that pursuing Julie Farrait with the same intensity applied to Frank's male lieutenants would have required resources and produced complications that federal prosecutors, having already secured Frank's comprehensive cooperation against the corrupt law enforcement network, may have judged not worth the additional investment. Whatever the specific combination of factors that produced Julie's relative legal safety compared to Frank's male associates, the outcome itself is significant. A woman with detailed knowledge of and substantial involvement in the financial architecture of one of the largest narcotics operations in American history navigated the collapse of that operation with a degree of legal and financial survival that her own intelligence and strategic capacity, as much as any external protection, helped secure. The marriage that survived all of this, the arrest, the cooperation, the 5 years of imprisonment, the process of rebuilding a life in the aftermath of an empire's collapse, deserves final consideration as the most enduring and, in some ways, most surprising element of Julie Farrait's story. Marriages do not typically survive the specific combination of stresses that Frank and Julie's relationship endured. The financial devastation of asset forfeiture, the social stigma of a husband's federal conviction, and extensive cooperation with law enforcement, the practical challenges of maintaining a relationship through years of imprisonment, and the complicated process of rebuilding any kind of normal life after the specific notoriety that Frank's case generated. Any one of these factors alone destroys most marriages. Frank and Julie's relationship survived all of them simultaneously. This survival suggests a partnership whose foundation went deeper than the glamour and excitement of Frank's early courtship of a Puerto Rican beauty queen, deeper than the shared enjoyment of the wealth that the empire generated during its peak years. It suggests a partnership built on the kind of mutual respect and demonstrated capability that develops between two people who have weathered genuine crisis together and emerged from it with their fundamental relationship intact, even as almost everything else about their circumstances had been transformed beyond recognition. Julie Farrait, in the years following Frank's release in 1981, remained his wife and partner through the complicated process of building whatever life remained available to a man who had been, simultaneously, the most significant narcotics trafficker in New York City history and the most consequential anti-corruption informant in the city's law enforcement history. She had known, by any reasonable accounting of the documented record, far more about the empire that defined their shared life than the historical record has generally credited her with knowing. She had navigated the specific legal and financial dangers of that empire's collapse with a strategic competence that deserves recognition independent of her husband's more thoroughly documented genius. And she had remained, through all of it, the courtship, the empire, the collapse, the cooperation, the imprisonment, and the long process of rebuilding, the partner that Frank Lucas trusted with the financial architecture of his empire, and, just as significantly, the partner he chose to protect even when his own strategic calculations led him to expose almost everyone else who had been part of his world. That is Julie Farrait's story, not the beauty queen who married a gangster and enjoyed the spoils of his success without understanding their source. The woman who knew, who managed, who navigated, and who survived with an intelligence and a strategic capacity that the larger Frank Lucas narrative has, for decades, failed to fully acknowledge. There is one more dimension of this story that deserves careful attention, because it goes to the heart of why Julie Farrait's narrative has been so consistently underexamined in the broader cultural memory of the Frank Lucas case. The 2007 Ridley Scott film that introduced Frank Lucas's story to its widest audience included a character based on Julie, played by Laimari Nadal, but the film's treatment of her character reflects exactly the kind of simplification that this examination has been working to correct. The film version of Julie functions primarily as a romantic interest and a symbol of Frank's success, a beautiful woman whose presence in his life signals his arrival at the top of his world without the character receiving the kind of independent development that would allow audiences to understand her own agency, her own knowledge, and her own strategic navigation of the dangers that came with marrying and remaining married to Frank Lucas. This is not a criticism specific to this particular film. It reflects a broader pattern in how stories about powerful men and women in their lives tend to get told, a pattern that consistently centers the man's choices and consequences, while reducing the women around him to supporting roles that exist primarily to illuminate aspects of his character, rather than to be understood as full participants in the events being depicted. Julie Farrait deserves better than this pattern, and not simply as a matter of fairness to her individual story. Understanding Julie's actual role, her documented knowledge, her involvement in the financial infrastructure, her strategic navigation of the empire's collapse, and the specific partnership that allowed her marriage to Frank to survive everything that followed, changes how we should understand the larger Frank Lucas narrative itself. An empire of the scale and sophistication that Frank built does not function through the efforts of one man alone, however brilliant and however disciplined that man might be. It functions through a network of trusted relationships, each contributing specific capabilities that the overall enterprise requires. Frank's brothers contributed territorial management and absolute family loyalty. His lieutenants contributed operational execution. The corrupt law enforcement officials he cultivated contributed protection from the institutions theoretically designed to stop him. And Julie Farrait contributed financial sophistication and strategic partnership that extended into the most sensitive and most legally perilous aspects of converting hundreds of millions of dollars in narcotics revenue into assets that could sustain a life of wealth and apparent legitimacy. Removing Julie from this picture, treating her as a passive beneficiary of Frank's success rather than an active contributor to the architecture that made that success sustainable, does not just shortchange her individual story. It distorts our understanding of how Frank's empire actually functioned, suggesting a level of solitary genius that obscures the genuine, collaborative structure that any enterprise of this scale and complexity actually requires. The real story of Frank Lucas's empire is not the story of one extraordinary man operating alone against the combined forces of the Italian mafia. The NYPD and the Diet is the story of a network of people, brothers, lieutenants, corrupt officials, and a wife with genuine financial sophistication, each contributing the specific capabilities that allowed the overall enterprise to function at a scale that no single person, however brilliant, could have sustained alone. Julie Farrait's contribution to that network deserves to be understood with the same seriousness and the same attention to documented detail that this channel has applied to every other element of the Frank Lucas story. She was not a footnote. She was not simply a beautiful accessory to a powerful man's rise. She was a participant whose specific knowledge, specific skills, and specific strategic decisions shaped both the empire's functioning during its peak years and its survival, in whatever diminished form survival was possible, through the catastrophic collapse that followed Frank's arrest. That is the story this video has tried to tell, not instead of the larger Frank Lucas narrative, but as an essential and previously underexamined part of it, the part where the woman at the center of the empire turns out to have known everything, and to have done something with that knowledge that nobody, watching from the outside with the simplified version of her story, ever quite expected. Consider for a moment the specific scene that this story's title evokes. Julie Farrait, sitting across from federal investigators in the months after Frank's arrest, facing the same fundamental question that her husband had faced and answered with such strategic clarity. What do you do when everything you have built is suddenly subject to forces far larger and more powerful than yourself? Frank's answer had been comprehensive cooperation in exchange for a reduced sentence, a calculation that exposed dozens of corrupt officials while protecting his own future. Julie's situation was different in ways that mattered enormously. She did not have comparable leverage to offer federal prosecutors. She had financial knowledge, certainly, but not the kind of institutional corruption intelligence that made Frank's cooperation so uniquely valuable to federal investigators trying to clean up their own ranks. What Julie had, instead, was something more personal and in some ways more difficult to navigate. The choice between protecting herself through whatever cooperation federal investigators might want from her, and protecting her husband and the family's remaining resources through a different kind of strategic silence and careful legal positioning. The specific path Julie chose, one that protected significant family resources, while avoiding the kind of severe prosecution that a woman, with her documented knowledge, might otherwise have faced, required threading. A needle that few people in her position have managed successfully. She needed to demonstrate enough cooperation and enough limited culpability to avoid prosecutors treating her as a primary target, while avoiding the kind of comprehensive disclosure that would have exposed her own conduct to the same severity of consequence that Frank's male associates faced. This is an extraordinarily difficult position to navigate, requiring legal sophistication, strategic patience, and the specific kind of composure under pressure that doesn't get taught and can't be faked. Julie Farrait navigated it successfully. Whatever combination of factors contributed to that success, her own strategic intelligence, the specific legal representation she secured, prosecutorial discretion that may have reflected gendered assumptions about her culpability that worked, in this instance, in her favor, or Frank's own decision to maintain a protective boundary around her, even within his broader cooperation. The outcome speaks to a woman who understood, with a clarity that mirrors her husband's most celebrated strategic moments, exactly what was required to survive a catastrophic situation with her resources and her freedom largely intact. This is the Julie Farrait that deserves to be remembered, not the passive beauty queen who happened to marry a powerful man. The woman who knew the architecture of one of the largest narcotics operations in American history from the inside, who helped build and maintain that architecture for years, and who, when everything collapsed, navigated the wreckage with a strategic intelligence that the historical record has consistently failed to credit her with possessing. That correction, giving Julie Farrait's story the same serious examination that this channel has given every other element of the Frank Lucas narrative, is what this video has tried to provide. There is a final piece of this story worth sitting with, because it reframes everything that came before it. Frank Lucas spent his entire operational life asking the question that defined his particular genius. Why does this have to work the way everyone assumes it works? He asked it about the supply chain in 1968 and built Blue Magic. He asked it about his own arrest in 1975 and built a cooperation agreement that became one of the most significant anti-corruption actions in New York law enforcement history. Julie Farrait, watching her husband ask and answer that question across a decade of empire building, learned to ask a version of it herself when her own moment of crisis arrived. The assumption that federal investigators and the broader public brought to Julie's situation was the assumption that defines how society has generally understood women connected to powerful criminal men, that she was either entirely innocent, a victim of her husband's choices with no independent agency of her own, or entirely complicit, a co-conspirator who deserved the same severity of consequence as the men around her. Julie Farrait refused to be contained by either assumption. She was neither purely innocent nor simply complicit. She was something more specific and more interesting, a woman with genuine financial sophistication who had built, alongside her husband, a portion of the architecture that sustained one of the largest narcotics operations in American history, and who, when that architecture collapsed, navigated the consequences with a strategic intelligence that deserves to be remembered as her own achievement, rather than simply a footnote to her husband's more celebrated genius. That is why this story matters, beyond the specific facts of Frank Lucas's empire and its collapse. It is a reminder that the people who get remembered as supporting characters in history's most dramatic stories often had far more agency, far more knowledge, and far more strategic capability than the simplified narratives ever credit them with possessing. Julie Farrait knew everything. What she did with that knowledge was survive, on her own terms, with an intelligence that deserves, finally, to be told completely. If this video gave you a perspective on the Frank Lucas story that you had never considered, if the realization that his wife held as much strategic intelligence and as much consequential knowledge as the men who get all the credit changed how you see the larger empire, subscribe right now and drop a comment with your honest answer. Was Julie Farrait a victim of circumstance, a full partner in the empire, or something more complicated that defies the easy label either side wants to apply to her? Next week, we go inside the most unlikely relationship in this entire story, the federal agent who spent years building the case that destroyed Frank Lucas's empire, and who Frank later trusted with his own appeals. Turn on notifications. The real story is always darker and always more complicated than the simplified version, and it almost always includes the people that history forgot to examine closely enough. One more historical thread deserves mention before this story closes, because it places Julie Farrait's experience within a pattern that extends well beyond Frank Lucas's specific empire. The women who occupied positions analogous to Julie's across the broader history of organized crime in America, the wives and partners of major criminal figures who held genuine knowledge and genuine financial sophistication without occupying the visible operational roles that defined their husbands. Public reputations have, almost without exception, received the same kind of historical erasure that Julie's story has suffered. Virginia Hill, associated with multiple organized crime figures, including Bugsy Siegel, was reduced in popular memory to a glamorous moll despite documented financial sophistication that historians of the period have only recently begun to take seriously. The wives of major Italian-American organized crime figures throughout the 20th century occupied similar positions of financial knowledge and strategic importance that the historical record, shaped largely by law enforcement documents and journalistic accounts that focused on the men. Consistently, why failed to examine with comparable seriousness. This pattern is not coincidental. It reflects specific assumptions about gender and criminal culpability that shaped how investigators, prosecutors, and subsequently journalists and historians approached these stories, assumptions that made it easier to see women connected to powerful criminal men as either innocent domestic partners or simple accessories to male achievement, and harder to see them as independent actors with their own knowledge, their own strategic capabilities, and their own consequential decisions. Julie Farrait's story, examined with the seriousness it deserves, becomes part of a broader historical correction that is overdue across the entire genre of organized crime history. The women were there. They knew. They participated in ways that varied in degree, but were rarely as simple as either complete innocence or complete complicity. And the specific intelligence and strategic capability they brought to navigating the catastrophic moments when these empires collapsed deserves to be remembered as their own achievement, not erased in service of narratives that find it more convenient to focus exclusively on the men whose names became synonymous with the empires themselves. Frank Lucas built Blue Magic and survived his own arrest through calculated cooperation that reshaped New York law enforcement. Julie Farrait built and managed significant portions of the financial architecture that sustained that empire and survived its collapse through her own calculated navigation of an entirely different kind of crisis. Both stories deserve to be told. Only one of them, until now, typically has been thought, this is the story this channel set out to tell, not because it diminishes anything about Frank Lucas's own extraordinary and deeply complicated legacy, but because understanding the full network of people who made that legacy possible gives us a more complete and more honest picture of how empires like this one actually function. Frank Lucas was brilliant. He was also not alone. Julie Farrait was there from the beginning to the end, knowing more than almost anyone gave her credit for, and doing more with that knowledge than the simplified version of her story has ever acknowledged. That is the correction this video has tried to make. And it is long overdue. So when you watch the film or read the simplified accounts, or hear the story told the way it usually gets told, remember that there is a woman at the center of it whose intelligence shaped the empire as much as her husband's did, whose strategic navigation of catastrophe matched his in its own register, and whose story deserves the same careful, documented, complete telling that every other element of this saga has received. That is what nobody saw coming. Not because Julie Farrait did something dramatic or violent or cinematic, because she did something quieter and, in its own way, more remarkable. She survived an empire's collapse with her intelligence intact, her resources protected, and her marriage unbroken, in a story that history almost entirely forgot to tell.